Good evening and welcome everybody to another Grow guest speaker series event. This is a ministry of Fort Myers Congregational UCC. Tonight we are so blessed to welcome public theologian, author, and kind of our neighbor, Brian McLaren, who is joining us again for a discussion on his new book. This is a book called Faith After Doubt. It is an absolute, I've been reading it, it's an absolutely fantastic and really thought-provoking book. And today we're here to discuss it. We're here with some folks who have done some reading into the book. Some folks haven't read it at all. Some folks have read the whole thing. We want this to be a conversation for all who are present, obviously, and I think it definitely will be. But today we're going to be looking at some specific moments in the book, or just even bringing up some specific questions that have been generated by our reading of it. And we are blessed to get to ask the author to expound on them, which is amazing. What a wonderful opportunity. So Brian, thank you so much for being with us tonight. If it's okay if I can start off with a quick question while people maybe find their paragraphs and underline some sentences. I want to know what prompted you to write a book like this or release a book like this right now? Like, why is now the time to talk about doubt?
Yeah, I think I give a statistic in the book that about 65 million adults in America today grew up going to church but dropped out now that they're adults. And it's somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million people join that club every year. And some of those people, there are a lot of different reasons why people are in that category. But for an awful lot of people, it's because they had questions, doubts, that they didn't feel their congregation was interested in. And they felt shamed or criticized for asking honest questions. So that's kind of the background reality. And that number, I think, is going to accelerate. But I think there's something else that's been going on really intensely for the last 20 years. I guess, I don't know if all of us on this call are Protestant, but I'm sure a lot of us have Catholic friends who, in the early 2000s, when the avalanche of reports of clergy abuse started coming out, across Catholicism, there's just been this huge trauma of having to face that the church that they thought existed, back in the idyllic 1950s and 60s, that other things were going on. And then add to that now in Catholicism, we have, I think, an absolutely wonderful Pope. Pope Francis, I think, is just setting such a great example. And then here they have this very positive Pope, and then there's this backlash against him. And so in Catholicism, there's real turmoil. And then in Protestantism here in the United States, if you think over the last 20 years, the number of scandals there have been of clergy, who have done inappropriate things. And then you think of what's happened in the last several years with this sort of flocking around Donald Trump, especially among white evangelicals, with 2016, 81% supporting him, 2020, about 75%. And you just think so many people have felt like, what happened, And there's lots and lots of evangelicals who say, their parents taught them that character mattered. Their parents taught them that honesty mattered. And then they just watched all of that go out the window. So there's this widespread disillusionment, Wesley. And it just seemed like this was maybe a good time to try to address for people how they can process their doubts and disillusionment without throwing their faith away, but actually having their faith maybe grow deeper and stronger as they are realistic about what's going on. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen in my own work as a chaplain and as a pastor, I've seen all of that stuff come to the fore. So I think you're absolutely dead on. So I was wondering what the people gathered think, though. So many have read at least the first chapter. Some have read, I think, the whole book. They are are overachievers, and we're grateful for them. But I want to know who has done a little bit of the reading. Do you have a sentence that you've underlined? Is there a paragraph that you've underlined? If so, I'd love to hear, you read it for us. If you just have a question that has come up from your reading, go ahead and, there's a lot of us. So if you know how to raise your hand on Zoom, go ahead and do that, or just raise your hand in real life, or, put up a little emoji reaction or something, and I'll call on you. So, all right, we got one from Udiel. Welcome.
Hey, Wesley. Hey, Brian. It's good to see you. There's so many familiar faces. It's awesome to see everyone here. Yeah, well, there is a sentence I wrote. There was a couple of that came to mind. I only read the first chapter, though, Brian. So I'm sorry. I'm not one of the overachievers in the call. But one thing that I think was really great, and, just to kind of underscores this very first question that Wesley asked. So the quote that I have here is, some things he read in the Bible seemed in tension with what he had always been taught, right? And I just, it resonated with me as someone, I personally grew up evangelical. I gone to church. When I was growing up, I used to go to church about 5 times a week. And I was part of the church band, so I used to be in church the other days too, practicing in order to be part of church. And so that was something that resonated with me. But also just hearing your comment now, do you think this is sort of new phenomena? I mean, I studied philosophy in college, and it doesn't seem to be something new in terms of this sort of questioning of inconsistencies, specifically within Christianity, right? As we move towards what, a more, I guess, rational worldview, right? Of that explains how you should go about. So that's just, I don't know, something that stood out to me, right? This sort of inconsistency, but also something else I think that came to me is I think you just kind of mentioned, right? You may be Catholic and it was pedophilia scandals that rocked you, or the male hierarchy, obsession with controlling women and stuff. I think there's also a lot to say about, right, the sort of social, political situations, right? And how it's kind of really bringing up even more inconsistency for people, because, to be a good person would be to support those who are not so well off, right? Or those who are being oppressed. But one's religion, unfortunately, if we're talking about Christianity, has been part of that oppression for so long, right? So those are just a couple of things that came to mind for me.
Hey, before I respond, Uriel, I have to know, what did you play in the church band?
Oh, I actually have the bass that I played right here.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Bass player.
Do you still play?
Yes, I do.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, as you can tell from behind me, I love music too. Uriel, yeah, you are so right. Here's what's interesting. The United States has always been an outlier in religion among European based nations, right? So, for example, if we went back 10 years, about 40% of Americans attended church regularly. If you went north of the border to Canada, it was about 20%. If you went across the Atlantic Ocean to England, it was about 10%. And if you went across the English Channel to Europe, mainland Europe, it was about 5%. And if you went to Eastern Europe, it was about 2.5%. So America's had this sort of high bar of church attendance. But what has happened in the last 20 years, and especially in recent years, is this statistical decline that had been steady since about the 1950s, just started taking a big statistical decline. And I think a huge part of it is exactly what you said, Uriel. I think it's, in fact, there's a bunch of research that's come out about this, that religious involvement in right-wing politics has driven away an awful lot of people. And maybe I could say 2 things about that probably a lot of you know about, but some of you, this might be news to you. I'm drawing from two books, one by Randall Balmer, and the other, oh, I'm just going to draw a blank on his name. It'll probably come to me. But Randall Balmer did a bunch of research about the rise of the religious right, and the religious right's focus on abortion. And what he found out, and many of you probably know this already, but this all happened in the 1970s. White evangelicals didn't really care about abortion before the late 1970s. And a rumor started spreading among both Catholic and Protestant churches in the late 70s that Jimmy Carter was going to take away tax exempt status from segregated church schools. So here they're getting tax exemption, but if they're they actually, a name for them was segregation academies. There were all these schools that were set up after desegregation so that white families would continue to just segregate. And a group of Catholic and evangelical leaders said, how are we going to protect ourselves? And they said, well, we can't very well say that we're having a movement to protect segregation. So there was a Catholic fundraiser on a call who said, why don't we make abortion our rallying cry? So a lot of people don't know that part of that history. And some people just can't imagine that in those 20 years from 1980 to 2000, that white evangelicalism was just so thoroughly mobilized around abortion. And when they started to lose steam on abortion, of course, then gay marriage was thrown into the mix. But the other piece of the story that a lot of people don't know is that in the mid 20th century, especially after in the early part of the century, in the growth of labor unions, a group of very wealthy white Christians, a group of very wealthy white business magnates decided that they wanted to get churches to be on their side against labor unions. And so what they did is they said labor unions are communism, labor unions are socialism. And a lot of people don't know that, that line in the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. Well, that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance during that time as part of this campaign funded by a group of wealthy industrialists who were trying to get God and big business to be seen as the same, as one and the same, or as inseparable. And I think what's happened, Uriel, since then is more and more people have had this feeling that Christianity doesn't make sense in relation to the real problems in our world. Like, what is their agenda? Where is it coming from? Why aren't they saying anything about race? Now, obviously, congregations like yours are, but so many aren't. Why aren't they saying anything about the environment? Why aren't they saying anything about climate change? Why aren't they saying anything about the oppression of migrant workers? So all of this has deep history. And I think in some ways this has all been intensified now because that history has sort of played itself out. And I personally think that January 6th was, in some ways, it maybe will be the high water mark, although it could get a lot worse. We could see an awful lot worse in the future. But I think January 6th showed where that sort of, decades of alliance of political and religious powers where it would lead. And then I'm sorry I'm rambling on so much, Uriel, but to your other question, in what we call the Enlightenment, which really is kind of a 17th century flowering of intellectuals in Europe who say, we've been told what to believe for a long time by religious authorities. Why don't we use our own minds? And why don't we give ourselves permission to think for ourselves? And this especially arose after what was called the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, when thousands and thousands of people were killed in Europe, especially Germany, by Protestants and Catholics having one fight with each other after another. And, in parts of Bavaria, 50% of the population died, both from warfare between Protestants and Catholics, and then because they were so busy fighting, they didn't plant their crops. And so then they had food shortages, and with food shortages came disease. And, by 1648, a whole bunch of people were saying, religion is killing us. All these people are so mean and violent. Can we just get together and get religion out of the picture and just talk rationally with each other? So that started something that, has been, still is present today. But then what happened, I think, in the 20th century, in both Catholicism and Protestantism, is that there was this reaction like, we're losing ground. And so they just needed to reassert themselves with even more authoritarianism. And that's probably the last thing I'll say is, a major thrust of this book is to say that doubt is not the enemy of faith. Pretending that you don't have doubts, that's an enemy of faith, because hypocrisy and pretense doesn't fit in with a healthy faith. But doubt is the enemy of authoritarianism. And that's one of the other reasons I think it's very important to have these conversations now. So sorry to ramble on like that, but that was you got me going with that question.
We brought you here to ramble, Brian. We're so grateful for it. So I have a couple questions in the chat, which, you know what, that might be a better system anyway. If you guys have a question, put it in the chat for me and I'll read it to Brian, and I'll be able to organize it a little bit better that way. So I have kind of two interrelated questions that were sent to me in the chat. And one says that the first, this gives us an opportunity to kind of talk about how doubt functions in your book, which I think is very cool in that whole tree ring structure. Yes. So the question is, the first chapter is called Doubt is Loss. But how can doubt be an adding to, right? How can it be something that's not a lack, but an introduction, right? And then yes, a related question being, if God demands firm, unwavering faith, then is doubt, then you'd think an omnipotent deity would like just make you believe. Is doubt then like evidence of free will?
Yes. What a great question. So, Hey, Wesley, tell me the first question again. I got so.
The first question is doubt. If your first chapter is called Doubt is Loss.
Yes.
How is doubt kind of an introduction of something new? Also, a follow-up question from that same person privately in the chat asked me, do you see atheists reading your book? Because one of the people who asked me the question was an atheist.
Yes. Yeah. So I really hope atheists read my book. I, through the years, hear from so many people who say, I couldn't keep believing in the God they taught me about. But that doesn't mean my mind is closed to thinking about the meaning of life and thinking about other ways to understand God and so on. So I know that's the case because I hear from folks, and I hope that will increasingly be the case. But the something when I was writing this book that I didn't actually realize I was going to do, I wanted to spend the first third of the book just talking about how hard doubt is and the different dimensions of why it's so hard, how it's hard psychologically. I mean, just inside of our own heads, doubt is difficult for us. For those of you who've read that part of the book, I talk about one understanding of brain science that's called the modular brain, and this idea that our brains have different parts, different modules that then are organized into, that have many submodules, and that those modules all work together at speeds so fast, much faster than our conscious minds. And so doubt messes up with that. It causes stress for us to have it individually. But there's huge social losses that we go through when family members threaten to reject us, when we're part of a church or a denomination and we ask a new question, we lose confidence in something and we find out we're not welcome anymore. People lose their jobs. And then of course, talk about fear and loss when people tell you God is going to get you if you don't believe this. Um, and, I mean, it just sounds abusive when you think about it. But those are the social dimensions of doubt that are very, very real. But maybe I could give, and if I say something that, offends anybody or you think I'm wrong, listen, I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm just using some examples, and no offense intended by this. But if we could go back about 500 years, every Christian in Europe woke up in a universe where the earth was in the center and there were 10 concentric spheres. They believed they were made of crystal. There were 10 crystal spheres, and God was on the outside. And the universe was literally like, well, it was very much like an aquarium. And it was a universe where these spheres move around the earth. And then, and I think it's so hard for us to imagine that universe, but if just that little bit I've described it, it's sort of cozy and it's defined, and there's an absolute up and an absolute down. And we're in the center of things, and human beings are the center. And because the church is very important, the church is in the center. And imagine having that view of the universe, and your view of God is connected to that view of the universe for, well, really all of Christian history up until the 1400s. And in the 1400s, Copernicus comes along and says, hey, I'd like to make a slight tweak to your model of the universe, right? And you can understand why then some years later when Galileo said, yeah, Copernicus was right, and I'm going to give you evidence for it, the church said, Galileo, come on down to Rome. We'd like to have a talk with you. And they threatened him with prison and torture and so on. And Protestants can't take any pride because both Martin Luther and John Calvin bitterly mocked Copernicus for daring to question what everyone knew was true. So you can see that if your view of God is all wrapped up with that view of the universe, and then you doubt that view of the universe, you don't know what to do with God. Your old concept of God is just shattered. Can you even believe in God anymore when the universe isn't in that sort of elegant, simple shape? But you think about what's happened now. Now our understanding of the universe, scientists argue whether there's 100 or 250 billion galaxies. I mean, imagine that. And that the universe is expanding. None of this was, even imagined back in those days in the past. And so now this universe is so much bigger. And whatever God is now, we have to take God into account in relationship to this universe. Now, I'll just tell you, for me, whatever God is a lot bigger and more interesting than just the keeper of an aquarium. And so you could say it's a huge gain when we're willing to doubt some of those ideas and let our concepts of what the universe is and life is, and however God fits in that now has to be adjusted. So that would be one way to answer that question, Wesley, to say that I think there are real gains, but they don't feel like gains in the early stages. Let me mention one other, a whole cavalcade of them. 500 years ago, what we would call mental illness was attributed to the devil. And so tens of thousands of women across Europe were arrested, tortured, killed as witches. Interestingly, many of them were at the age of what we would call perimenopause. And so they were maybe having menopausal symptoms and without the benefit of medications and hormone therapy and things we have, and women were killed. And you think, thank God somebody started doubting that, that understanding of mental illness. If we hadn't doubted the old explanation, we would never have become more humane. And then you can just keep pushing that forward. to, for example, uh, people who are part of the LGBTQ community were considered to have a mental illness when I was a boy, right? So you think if people hadn't been willing to doubt that, and of course some still do, but we get a chance to become more humane. So that would be one of the big gains that I think happens from those kinds of doubt.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I've got a question from Chelsea. Not all doubts lead to a positive new concept. Some lead to extremism and radicalism. How does
Yes.
doubt go too far? Does rejection of some or all doctrine allow for the faith to no longer be collective and instead be completely personal? If unchecked, is that a risk in this whole
Wow.
enterprise of doubt?
So Chelsea, what a great question, and really a timely question. For some of you maybe have gotten this far in the book, but I quote a really interesting guy who was considered a real outlier back when I was a teenager, named Alan Watts. But Alan Watts said he made a distinction between faith and beliefs, and he said faith is an orientation toward what we don't know, that is a commitment to saying, I want to know the truth. So he described faith as a way of living with our unknowing that is always curious and hungry for the truth. But he said beliefs are in a sense the opposite. And here's the way he said it. He said, faith is like a window that looks out at the world. But some days we look out at the world and it's rainy. And for Micah, it's snowy. And we don't want it to be rainy and snowy. So what we do is we take some nice blue and white paint and we paint clouds on our window. He said that's often what our beliefs are. Our beliefs are what we say to ourselves to make the world be the way we want it to be. And so here's where life gets interesting, because if we are beginning to perceive some things in reality that make us uncomfortable, and people are trying to tell us things that make us uncomfortable, and we decide to doubt them, then what we very often will do is substitute a conspiracy theory, substitute we're desperate for something that will tell us what we want to hear. And politically, I think this is one of the things that we see going on in the world. You all might remember about a year ago, the person who was our president about a year ago, remember he kept saying, oh, this is just like the flu. Oh, it's no big deal. It'll be gone by April. It'll just go away. And, millions of people, that's what they wanted to hear. And so when people tell you what you want to hear, you'll doubt everybody else because of our biases. And what Alan Watts suggested is that true faith is wanting to know what's true, even if it's not what I want to hear. Interesting insight on his part. Well, maybe that's a good place for me to stop with that, and we might want to follow up or go in another direction.
I have a question from Sandy Blackington, which is, if you believe that we do not know what we do not know, is that an element of doubt? Very, very philosophical, Sandy. And then, so you go ahead and answer. I've got another question coming up, but you go ahead and go with that one.
Yeah, well, one of the things that happens when, many of you are familiar, the area of philosophy that deals with this is called epistemology. How do we know? How do we know that we know? How do we know that we know that we know? And how do we account for when we discover that what we knew was actually false? And so this, and when people study epistemology, they very often study some really interesting things like optical illusions, and bias is a huge part of epistemology. So one of the things that happens when we really start bearing down on this is we realize that our knowledge is always situated and it's always partial. And there's something in the Christian tradition that really could help us with this. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but for some of you, this might be new. But in the Middle Ages, there were debates. There was something called scholasticism, and there were big debates between different theologians. And some of them advocated for what they called the cataphatic approach, and others advocated for what they called the apophatic approach. And the cataphatic theologian said, God is knowable, God is understandable. Our brains are, of course, they didn't understand brains the way we do, but, because we're made in the image of God, we have the capacity to know God and communicate with God and have God communicate with us. And so we can use words and statements to describe God. That's the cataphatic way. Other theologians said, no, not so easy. If you can understand it, that's just shrunk down to the size of your understanding. God always has to be bigger than your understanding. And so the apophatic theologian said, we can talk all we want, but in the end, we have to be quiet. And we have to acknowledge that all of our knowledge is partial. And we have to, in a sense, have the posture of listeners and with openness, and always be ready to say that the truth is bigger and better and different than our current knowledge. Does everybody have a feel for that? Apophatic, cataphatic. And in the apophatic tradition, what they would say is, we're not saying you're not allowed to talk about God, but we're just saying you better be careful when you talk about God, because it's very easy to shrink God to the concepts that you associate with certain words. So one of their practices was to say, take one of your statements about God. God is a righteous judge. God is a righteous judge. Okay, that's one of your beliefs. And then they'd say, now let's look at the opposite. They'd say, what if we were to say, God is not a judge? Is there truth to that? And they would invite people to take the things they believed and look at the opposite and say, could you also believe that in some way? And it's a little bit like a Buddhist koan. By taking two opposite things and putting them together, they said you'll get closer to understanding by putting those things in tension. So we might say, well, what do we even mean by the word judge? And then we realize that in today's world, judges are primarily about punishment. But then we might find out that back in the ancient times, judges were primarily about protection for the oppressed. Oh, so maybe our problem is in the way we define judge. So when we say God is a judge, we better say, depending on how you define judge. And so now we're challenged to think more deeply about our understandings of God. And I think we really need a dose of apophatic theology these days, because so many people talk about God as if God were just a thing or object that they have all defined and all figured out. And so much of this flows, I think, from very kind of immature and unhelpful ways of reading the Bible. And we could talk more about that too, if you'd like.
Thank you, Brian. And I hope everybody brought their Van A. Harvey Dictionary of Theological Terms to help them distinguish apophatic and cataphatic. I'm curious if anybody has another question. Go ahead and send it to me in the chat, or I guess at this point, since you can go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask it. All right, I do know that I have a repeat customer, so I'll just let him ask the question. Udi, I'll go ahead.
Sorry about that. Brian, and maybe, well, I do want to preface this question by saying that I resonated a lot with the first chapter of the book as someone that I feel I've actually gone through the very same process that you're kind of talking about, this doubt. Yeah, as I mentioned, I studied philosophy in college, and I think that was really kind of a source of a lot of doubt for me, and made me question my religious and my religion and my upbringing. And it was a source of, it continues to be a source of turmoil with my family and with those who I grew
Yes.
up with, right? And so I resonated significantly with that. I think this question, I think it's coming from the source of a doubter, right? So if
Yes.
someone who's reading the book and is a doubter, right, or is going through this situation, there's a sentence that you wrote, right, about your friend who was a close friend, right? And you know,
Yes.
the quote is, if you lose the inerrancy of scripture, you lose the inspiration and authority of scripture too. And if you lose that, you lose everything. And I'll never doubt that for a second, right? And so my question to you, and maybe this is, you know, there's going to be an answer in the book or something, and it's a little long, but when your faith, which has been the source of morality, right, seems to be heading away from what is moral, right? When your faith, which is your source for universal truths, also seems to be taking so many hits on that end, right? Kind of being
Yes.
wrong on a lot of those, then how or even why should you reconcile your faith, right? Or this upbringing, right? Rather than just, you know, rather than this continued participation in it, should you just let it go?
Yes.
Why that, you know? And so that's a question. And from someone that I feel I've asked myself that a lot.
Yeah.
And because of coming from an upbringing where I was an evangelical, I made a decision that I wanted to step away from
Yeah.
that, you know? And so,
Yeah. Yeah. So, Uriel, you're making me feel really good right now because I do not answer that question in this book. But when I wrote this book, it's part of a 2-book series, and the second book is called "Do I Stay Christian?" And that's exactly the focus. And I'm actually just finishing up that book now to come out next year. But let me explain the relationship between the two, and then say something to your question. Um, you might say Faith After Doubt is written for people who are where you were when you started college, in the sense that they're beginning to have questions, and their religious communities have given them an all or nothing approach. Either you accept this whole package or you leave it. And it's this, in a later chapter, I tell a story of a guy who actually he was an aerospace engineer. And he said to me, when I was a kid, I played with Legos. And when I started going to church, I realized that Christianity was like this big Lego project. And I'd have all these beliefs and I'd snap them together and I'd create this fortress, right? And if I took one out, the whole thing would start to fall apart. So many people are given that all or nothing idea. And what I'm inviting people to do is to doubt that and say faith is not a Lego project. Faith is more like a journey. And in that journey, we're constantly picking up things and then putting things down. And because our goal isn't to get into a fortress and stay there. On a journey, you're actually going somewhere. And of course it should change, because if it's working in your life, it's changing you. And if the world is changing, you're encountering new things. And so this all or nothing approach in some ways is what I'm trying to help people who are in Christian faith or other faiths, because Muslims and Jews and Buddhists, everybody goes through this. I've had conversations with people across religious traditions. It's especially hard for Christianity, though, because Christianity has been unusually obsessed with beliefs. And especially because Protestants and Catholics have been arguing for 500 years about who has the right beliefs. And when you have two groups arguing about who has the right beliefs for 500 years, one thing that they both become sure of is that beliefs are the really, really important thing. And I'm suggesting, no, actually, Christian faith isn't a set of beliefs. It's a way of life. It's a quest. It's a pursuit that is inspired by someone's life. But it's not, but to define it as this Lego fortress, I think is a mistake. In the second book that though, is where I really deal a little bit more with what you're saying, Uriel. And there's a lot I could say, but maybe I could say it like this. Well, I'll just tell you how this next book is set up. The first third of the book is called No. The title is Do I Stay Christian? So part 1 is no. And I have 10 chapters on the 10 best reasons I can think of to not stay Christian. And I think most people, when they read the book, they're going to think, wow, this guy is definitely not a Christian, because they're powerful reasons. They're really powerful reasons. And then the next 10 chapters are called Yes. And that's where I offer, not minimizing the first 10 chapters at all, but reasons why you might want to stay Christian, knowing those, what you know from the first 10 chapters. And then the last part is called How. And that's basically saying this: whether or not you stay a Christian, you have to figure out how you're going to live. You say, well, I'm not going to live like that anymore. Okay, how am I going to live? And my proposal is that if you're going to stay Christian and if you're not going to stay Christian, this is a very good time to figure out how you want to live. And probably, Christian or not, there are certain things you're going to want to do, ways you're going to want to direct your life. And what's interesting is, if you want to stay Christian, you can find those resources in the Christian faith. You can find slightly different, but also helpful resources in different traditions as well. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, there's one of the chapters that in that third part about how, that is just called Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, and Share. And that sounds like we're talking about your recyclables and your trash. But there's a statement in the environmental community, actually comes from someone named Annie Leonard. And Annie coined this saying, there is no away. And what she means by that is, you can't throw anything away. There is no away. And of course, now we realize that every bit of plastic that's ever been made is still there somewhere. It might be microplastics in the Arctic ice sheet or in our own bodies. It might be floating out in the Pacific Ocean. It might be in a landfill, but there is no away. And one of our huge challenges moving forward is to realize there is no away. So here's the problem. If we throw away Christianity, it doesn't go away. Somebody else, all the worst things about Christianity, somebody else is now picking them up. That can become a reason to say, how do we heal Christianity? How do we redeem it? How do we turn all of those destructive things into constructive things? In other words, how do we kind of recycle them in a constructive way? So I think that's part of the thought process that a lot of people are going through. One of the terrible things about Christianity is that about a third of the world's people, different estimates are between 29 and 33% of the world's people identify as Christian. It's the largest religion in the world. 21 to 24% of people identify as Muslim, second largest religion. But when a third of the world's people, and that third has the most money and the most weapons, when those people are identified as Christian, if Christianity is unhealthy, everybody in the world suffers. And if it's healthy, maybe everybody in the world benefits. So this sense that, what are we going to do with it? Whether we stay Christian or not, I think is a live question for lots of people. Yeah.
I got myself in over my head, guys, with this chat thing. I have a beautiful multi-part question that's chopped up over multiple chat responses. So I'm just going to ask Sandy Buller to unmute herself and ask her beautiful multi-part question.
She's not going to claim it. I'll claim it.
No.
Okay, it's Jim's
question.
But I was, as a professional church educator, first of all, Brian, I really appreciate your use of developmental theory and your personal story and stories in general. The book comes alive with all of that for me, and that was helpful. But also the question is around doubt. And doubt is not just intellectual.
Yeah.
That's, I think most of the time when I hear the word, it sounds like a belief doubt or an intellectual doubt.
Yeah.
And you expand on how it's survival and belonging and meaning,
Yes.
as you've mentioned before. But my question is kind of between the four stages, is doubt noticeably different between each of the stages? And then just kind of the fun question, can you spot a stage 4 believer or a stage 4 person, of a faith stage 4 person in a crowd?
What a great question. So first, I don't think we've really mentioned this yet, Jim, so I'm glad you bring it up. At the center of the book, for those of you who've just read the first chapter, you wouldn't have gotten there yet. Like Jim, I'm really interested in theories of human development. And there's some that are especially focused on faith development, some on intellectual, cognitive development, some on moral development. There's a whole lot of different theorists, and I've been, it's been sort of an interest of mine through my whole adult life. And what I try to do is find whatever patterns I could in those different theorists. And so I offer a very simple 4-stage model, and it overlaps, and I put a little thing in the appendix if you're interested to see how it overlaps with some major theorists. And I always like to say life is messy, and I want to be the first to admit that not everybody is going to fit into this model, but it seems to be helpful for a lot of people. Stage 1 is simplicity. That's dualism, learning all of the simple, easy dualisms: in, out, us, them, safe, dangerous, friend, enemy, heretic, orthodox, all of those dualisms. And that's in many ways what we mean when we say raise a child. We take a child and help that child learn those dualisms. A lot of people stay in stage 1 for their whole lives. And a lot of religious communities, thank God, not this one, but a lot of religious communities stay in stage 1. And in fact, if you leave stage 1, they kick you out, or they tell you you're a sinner, you're dangerous, you're terrible. And stage 1 is super oriented around authority figures, because when you're a child, you don't know what, is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this poison? Is this nourishing? And so, there's this trust and dependence on authority figures. And here's what I would say, Jim. In stage 1, it's very hard to doubt. When you doubt, if you're really in stage 1, here's what happens in your mind. I know the world is simple. There are good guys and bad guys. I thought I was with the good guys. Oops, I'm with the bad guys. I'm going to go join them. They're the good guys. Does that make sense? In a sense, within stage 1, you can't, that's just the way you look at the world. Good guys and bad guys. I want to be with the good guys. So sometimes people grow up in one religion in stage 1, and then they join another religion that's also a stage 1 religion. They don't really grow through that. They just find more satisfaction in it. But what happens at the end of stage 1 is, what happens if you say, these people I grew up with who taught me right from wrong and taught me all my dualisms, right? I don't think they're right about everything. Because I went over to dinner at my friend's house, and they're Jewish, and they have a different way of seeing the world. And there's some good in their way of looking at it too. And then I have a friend at school who's an atheist, and he's a nice person too. And so what happens is, when you say, I'm not just living in my one little simplistic world anymore, I've got to negotiate between a complex world. Life isn't as simple as I thought. So very often doubt about stage 1 is what makes you say, I don't think life is that simple. I'm doubting life is that simple. I'm ready for more information. And we move into complexity. And that gets people a long way. I remember so clearly, and Jim, as a Christian educator, you'll sort of understand this. I was in college, and I found out there was this big debate in Christianity between Calvinists and Arminians. And for those of you who don't know what those words mean, just be so happy and thankful. But this divided Christians for a long, long time. And I remember thinking, I'm 19 years old. Probably by the time I'm 21 or 22, I will have this whole thing figured out. And in stage 2, you think, I can fix this. I can solve this. I can get an answer to this. And I've just got to get more information, you know. And so stage 2, I call a stage of pragmatism. And this sense that I can figure it out, I can make it work, that carries you through stage 2. You can see the difference. Stage 1, I need an authority figure to tell me. Stage 2, I can figure it out on my own. But then, and within stage 2, you might have doubts that this book gives you the best 5 steps to success. It might be this book that gives you the best, but you're still sure there's 5 steps to success somewhere. But when you then start to doubt whether that whole approach to life even works, and you start to become suspicious of the whole thing, that becomes your portal into stage 3. And in the book, that's where I say all in doubt, because in some ways, now in stage 3, I have no choice. I have to doubt everything I've been given up to this point. And that's where so many people just find there is no church that allows me to do that. I can't tell you, in this month since the book came out, I've been getting emails from so many people who are telling me exactly that. I know every church in my county, there is not one place I can go with my questions, people say. So that's that stage 3. And here's where it really gets interesting, because in stage 3, you think, I can see through anything. I can deconstruct anything. I can find the faults in everything. And then when you say, and where am I then? And then you think, how am I going to put a life together? I can find the faults with everyone else, but now I have to live. And when, in a sense, then you become cynical about your cynicism and skeptical of your skepticism, and you think there's got to be some way to put this back together. That, I think, is what often becomes the portal into stage 4, which then I think eventually becomes your new simplicity that you get used to, and then you'll face new complexity. And then that's why I think these are kind of like rings on a tree, and they just keep expanding outward. So I hope that's helpful. Hey, Jim, did you have a favorite developmental theorist yourself?
Probably Fowler was, as I was growing up in terms of faith development.
Yes.
I like your 4 instead of a larger number.
And they match pretty well, I could pull it up, but these 4 match pretty well. You could take 2 of Fowler's and put them here and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Micah just sent me a beautiful question that I'm not going to read all of. So Micah, I would love it if you would read that question. I'm going to stick in a really quick thing. If anybody's ever been to seminary, Brian has this illustration in the book of like, you've taken your belief system and you've dissected it and hollowed it out, and then it just blows away in the wind. That was my seminary experience. So I think that's many of ours too. So Micah, I'd love it if you would read your question. That'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Wesley. And thank you, Brian, so much. And thank you all for these great questions. So I love the line on page 76 that says, acknowledging how little we know is, I think, at the core of mature faith.
Yes.
What we boast of as great faith may merely be a boatload of indoctrination and overconfidence.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it in and of itself. And I also love it because it reminds me of the final phrase of Micah 6:8,
Yes.
walk humbly with your God.
Yes.
And I'd like to believe that this very simple and very complex phrase is the answer to the question of not only how to live a faithful and ethical life, but also how to win all of our continuing fights for social justice.
Yes.
But I feel like when I look at the country around us, we live in a country where brash overconfidence so often reigns, where the loudest voices tend to be the most heard, where the most violent people tend to win the wars, where empire and white supremacy are still boldly spreading lies and stealing the spotlight. And so I want to know how you think that a faith based in deep humility can actually be heard and effective in the public square, and how it can actually get attention and change policy, and how it can actually get the chance to transform us and our social systems in a time when indoctrination and overconfidence seem to be the only way to win hearts and minds and attention.
Yes. First of all, does everybody feel the power of that question? Thank you, Micah. That's so well put. You know, Micah, my guess is that arrogant, confident people are very often frightened and desperate people, and they're sort of doubling down on something to help them get through their fear or their shame or their desperation. And I certainly think that's a big part of what's going on with white supremacy. I have an African-American friend, and she said to me, she said, I really feel very sorry for white America. She said, I think white America has a deep, deep fear. And the fear is if they don't stay in control, Black people will do to them what they did to Black people. So it puts them in this desperate position to have to try to stay in control. Obviously, it's not all white people, but there's that sort of general whiteness that I think she was touching something. And then I'll never forget what she said. She said, I always want to tell white people, why would we ever want to be like you? Why would we ever want to do to you what you did to us? We don't want to be that way, you know? But I think her statement that fear is so much at the core of this is, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And fear, as we know, I write about this in the book, but fear taps into those deepest, and people often say the most primitive part of our brain, but it's really the most well-developed part of our brain in the sense that it's been around the longest, right? That's those survival mechanisms. We wouldn't be here if they hadn't been around for so long. And they started back in the fish and the reptiles, and they've had a long time to be really fast and good at what they do. So fear is so deeply rooted in us because survival, it depends on being alert to danger. And what it looks like to me, Micah, is that when you have fearful people using fear to motivate people, and then other people respond by using fear to motivate people, you get in this escalation of fear that very often leads to war. I hate to say it, but I think that's what happens. And many of you may have heard of someone named J. Paul Lederach. He's one of the world's leading authorities on peace. And this means that he has to study war. And one of the things he says about war is most wars don't end because somebody wins. Most wars end because people get tired and exhausted, and they just think this is killing us all. This isn't worth it. Some wars are decisively won, but even then, it's not that the other people are wiped out. It's that they say, this isn't worth it anymore. We're done. And you wonder what it's going to take to make us say, we're tired of this, we're done. And to be very concrete in our circumstance, I'll be honest, Joe Biden was not my first choice when I was back in the primary season, but I'm pretty impressed about the way he's handling things. He's sure handling them better than I would have, And I think what he might be doing is he might be creating enough stability so that people who've been amped up by fear might say, I think I'd rather opt for the stability than keep amping up the fear. Now, some won't. Some are going to keep amping up the fear because that's how they make a living. And I think some have become addicted to it because I do think there's an addictive quality to rage. And I also think there's, to be perfectly honest, I think there's sort of a psychological syndrome of rage, where rage becomes the only way people feel alive and happy. And that becomes increasingly dangerous. But that to me, I think is what's going to happen now. And to me, this is the opportunity for some of us to try to be in the world, not being weak, being bold but humble. And that bold humility, it seems to me, goes into a space and is not reactive, isn't, those people, you think of Dr. King. I was just watching, because it's Black History Month, I saw a interview with him on television the other night. And I'm just struck, he's not trying to impress anybody. He's just like centered and quiet. He's almost a little boring, right? Like he's not trying to be, he's just calm and stable. And you get the feeling this man has something that the rest of us don't have. And that's to me what becomes I think that begins to attract enough people to then say, there's another way to do this.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. And I want to continue to be, man, we've got so many good people on this call, and I'm sure there's so many good questions, and it's so frustrating that it's 8:31, but I want to be respectful of your time because we're grateful for it. It is, as it is time for you to depart, do you have any closing thoughts for us? Is there anything you kind of wish came up that you just really wanted to talk about?
Oh my gosh, you guys are wonderful. I just love these questions. This is really, really enjoyable and fun for me. And what a beautiful thing. What we've just done, can I just tell you all, you might take this for granted because you're used to it. But, I was on a call last night with 40 people, and they were from all around the country, and they were all telling me, we don't know of any church where we could have this kind of conversation. And so, it's a special thing when people can create and find those kinds of spaces. And thank God there are more and more of those kinds of faith communities out there. But I'm just really, really grateful for all of you. I hope the book will be useful to you. I'm honored by your attention and time in this conversation. And Wesley, if you do have another question queued up, I could take one more, but if this is a good stopping point, that's fine too.
I don't actually have one queued up right now, so I think I just am getting thank yous in the chat.
Oh, great.
So we are, again, honored by your time. We're blessed to have you with us. Everybody, we're going to do another guest speaker next month, 7:30, first Friday of every month. This is an ongoing thing. So thank you again, Brian, and everyone have a lovely night and a lovely month, I guess. So take care.
Thank you, everybody. Love to you all.
Thank you.